Welcome to Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. A couple of weeks ago, over 126 million people voted in America, in spite of the false argument that one vote makes a difference. And yet, after a 16-month campaign, it was as if the election itself was a national catharsis. Like most big elections, it was a gut check. Not a process, as many philosophers would have us believe, about rational choice and policy papers, but about emotion, tribalism, identity politics, and yes, even a form of entertainment and recreation. It's all part of what some would call the voting paradox. And we're going to talk about that today with my guest, Eyal Winter. He's a professor of economics at the University of Leicester, as well as the Center for the Study of Rationality at Hebrew University. He's the author of the previous book, Feeling Smart, While Our Emotions Are More Rational Than We Think. He's one of the world's leaders in the study of decision-making and has served as chairman of the economics department at Hebrew University. He's lectured in over 130 universities in 26 countries, and it is my pleasure to welcome Eyal Winter to Radio Who, What, Why. Eyal, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jeff. It's nice talking to you.
One of the things that we see over and over again, particularly on a national level, is that elections do matter with respect to policy, and yet the bottom line seems to be that that's not what drives people to participate in them. Talk a little about that first.
No, that's not what drives people to participate in elections. Why people vote, the reason why they vote is because they belong to a tribe. They're driven by emotions. You know, the Clinton era where we have this phrase, it's the economy dummy, it doesn't apply anymore. People don't vote in order to improve their own economic situation or because of some sort of interest, self-interest reasoning. They vote because they're driven by emotions, by resentment, by loyalty, by pride, by frustration, and to some extent also fear. And this is what actually triggered the support to Trump in the U.S. and to some extent also the support to Brexit. So I think the main issue which we are sort of outlooking is this famous German word called Schadenfreude, the joy of having other people suffer. In the last several decades, there is an increasing inequality between those who have and those who don't have, and the way people react to it is by wanting this other group that has more to suffer. Recently, there has been a stunning number that I saw this morning in The Guardian says the following. Listen to this number. Brexit vote wipes $1.5 trillion off in UK household finances only in 2016 alone. Okay? And you ask yourself, why did these people vote to wipe off so much of their financing? And the answer is that this loss is not uniformly divided across all the population. It's those who have that pay more. And those who enjoy it are those who voted against it and voted for Brexit. And we have a lot of experimental record that show that people are willing to pay in order for other people to lose, especially when they feel that they are discriminated, that they are treated unequally, that there are people who earn more than them. People are willing to pay to make other people to lose. People are willing to some extent burn money, prefer to burn money than having this money goes to the other people who are richer than them. And this, I think, what triggered both the support to Trump in the U.S. and the support to Brexit in the UK, and potentially the forthcoming support to right-wing parties in other countries in the EU.
Is this something that is a modern phenomenon? Is it something that is a part of our politics and of globalism today? Or is this something that, in your view and in your research, is simply wired into democracy?
It's a recurrent phenomenon. It's not something totally new. I mean, resentment towards people who are doing better, substantially better, has been around for ages. This was the cause, to some extent, this was the reason for the communist revolution in the beginning of the 20th century in the Soviet Union. This was the cause for the rise of fascism and Nazism in Europe, has been around because there are periods in which inequality extends and others in which inequality is shrinking. You tend to see this phenomena in periods in history where inequality is more pronounced, and unfortunately, we are in such an era now, and this is to some extent a reaction to this era.
One of the things that your research points out is the way in which the connection that moral choices and moral philosophy impact voting choices in ways that we might not expect.
I think there is ideology plays a substantial role in voting. Ideology is also something that connected to emotions and to moral sentiment, but it's not coming really from the rational aspect of moral sentiment. It's coming more from for feeling as part of a tribe, feeling as part of a group, identity, wanting to identify with a group that think like you and belong to your thought, your ideology. So it's not very much coming from a rational attitude to moral sentiment. It's more coming from ideology that is hardwired in emotions.
Is this why cultural issues have become such a large part of our politics today?
Yes, because cultural linked very strongly to ethnicism, where you came from, what your background, and ethnicism is something that connects very, very strongly to identity, and this is why it plays a substantial, both ethnicism and cultural in general, plays a substantial role in people decisions about voting. It turns out that people vote very similarly within families, for instance, and within social groups. So it's very much a question: where do you belong? Who you feel yourself being part of?
One of the things you talk about is this idea of ideology, that we have this craving for ideology, that we need to attach to ideology, but it's not ideology in the rational way or the philosophical way we might think about it, but that it is deeply embedded in emotion.
Yes. I mean, there's some startling research evidence coming from political scientists who work together with geneticists that show that, to some extent, genetics can have some predictive power on whether you're going to vote right or left, whether you're Republican or Democrat. And this is quite startling, but if you think about it, it's not that surprising, because we know that genetics has to do with personality. And we know that left and right are emphasizing different personality issues. Left is about solidarity, is about community, is about sharing, whereas right is about authority, to some extent about individualism. So people are trying to match the personality to ideological trends, and this actually get them either to identify with left or right, depending on who they are. People try to match their identity or match their personality also to a political figure. So people who voted for Trump, to some extent, are similar in their personality to whatever Trump is representing. So, it boils down to identity and personality, and these are the issues that actually affect our decision about where to vote or to whom to vote more than our own interest. And this is to some extent worrying, because you want people to vote for somebody who is making the right decisions in terms of substance, not in terms of abstract ideology. But this is not going to happen.
Given that, what are the chances? Why do politicians even try to persuade voters? If minds are so set, given those outside forces that you're talking about, what are the chances of even persuading anyone to vote differently than they might have started out at the beginning of an election campaign?
Not much. If you notice in the recent election, also both in the U.S. and in the case of Brexit, there hasn't been a major population that moved from one side of the map to the other side of the map because of some people or some newspaper or media or candidate convincing the major part of the voters that his or her policy makes more sense than the other one. So this is not happening, okay? I think a lot of money is wasted on campaign, and campaign is actually is not effective. People, at least not in these recent elections, people are basically convinced about who they want to vote from the outset, and it wouldn't change. Okay, there are some people who are borderlines. It's hard to estimate the how significant this population is, but those people, and this is the vast majority who were more or less convinced at the beginning of the campaign, will remain convinced at the very end, and so to some extent, campaigning is a waste of money.
Talk a little bit about this notion of entertainment and the way in which that also plays a role in how people feel about participating in the voting process, that it has this kind of recreational aspect to it.
Right. I mean, I have a research done with a colleague, Esteban Clor, in which we examined turnout behavior in U.S. election for governors, and what we found out that in cases where the polls were very close, turnout logically was much more substantial than in cases where there was a big gap between the winning party and the losing party. However, the most interesting finding that we made is that in those cases in which the polls were closed, it was more those supporters of the majority party that turned out. Okay? Mm-hmm. And when we try to interpret this result, the best explanation that we found is that showing up, turning out for the election, is to some extent similar to showing up to a football match or a baseball match. First of all, you'll be more incentivized to attend if you expect the game to be interesting, and the game will be interesting if the two teams are very close in power. Okay? which is exactly what we see in elections. Secondly, you are likely to enjoy the game more when you expect your team to win rather than when you expect it to lose. It's nicer to see the game when your team is winning than when you see your team losing. This is again what happens in elections. The turnout of the stronger party is typically greater than the turnout for the weaker one. We haven't seen it so much in a so much pronounced way in the current election. I think that in the current election, one of the reasons why the polls were wrong in their prediction is that one thing they disregarded is that people often cheat in these polls. And they say, and one reason to cheat is that if you feel embarrassed to express a view that you think is unpopular, is to some extent deviates from the social norm. And many of the Trump supporters were worried to admit that they are supporting Trump when they face pollsters polling them and asking who are you going to vote. But when they are behind the curtain facing the ballot, why should I care? Nobody is seeing me, and I can be very truthful to myself and vote for whomever I want to give my vote. So this aspect has been missed by the polls, and this is why they were wrong, right? They were wrong because they assumed that people are telling the truth. There's a very nice experiment that was conducted several years ago here in Israel, where a statistician was conducting a poll one day after a national election, asking people. He actually conducted a huge poll, following all the statistical requirements for an absolutely high-quality poll, but asked only one question. And this question was, did you turn out to vote or not? And about 90% of the people answered, yes, of course. And when he looked at the actual turnout, it turned out that it was about 60%. So this shows you that about 30% were cheating. And of course they were cheating because it's not nice to say that you didn't turn out. You're supposed to turn out. People expect you to turn out. And likewise, many people felt that it's not nice to say I'm a true supporter of Trump. Who wants to admit that he or she, especially she, is going to vote for somebody who is actually a sex offender for one reason, right? And this is something that I think has been missed totally by the polls.
One of the ironies in this is this idea that while ideology is emotion-based, as we've talked about before, that those that are elected claiming a specific ideology often get boxed in by having to be true to that ideology, even though that was not the driving force that ultimately elected them.
Yes, I think are eager to some extent to show ideology because voters are suspicious about politicians for good reasons. And politicians, through histories, have that record of caring for their own interests, starting by appointing people who are close to them down to being corrupt, totally corrupt. And voters, to some extent, perceive ideology as the proof that the person, the politician, is going to care for them rather than caring for his own interests. This is obviously wrong. And quite often, politicians tend to portray themselves as being ideological in order to satisfy this craving by voters for ideology. But they manage to cheat quite effectively those voters that are desperate for ideology as a proof of the sincereness of the politician.
Is there a cyclical nature to any of this when we have gone through periods where political decisions have been ruled so powerfully by emotions as opposed to any kind of rationality? Do we then follow that with periods of rationality?
I think politics and social life in general runs in cycles. Also economics, we talk about business cycles and economics, but there is also political cycles. And there are periods in which emotions drive us to such dark corners in life, such as, take Europe, 1939 to 1945, that afterwards we become sober and we actually say, we don't say, but we act in a more rational and more reasonable manner, okay? And sometimes you need this history shock or political shock in order to discipline people and make them realize that things can go very dark when emotion alone determine politics. And hopefully things this time won't become that dark, and people will become sensible again. But yes, politics is running in cycles, not only in terms of emotions versus rationality, but also in terms of right versus left, Republican versus Democrats, Labor versus conservatives, and so on and so forth. So people get disappointed from one type of voting, from one trend of voting when it doesn't work out, and they seek alternatives that might work better. And this is the real hope at the end of the tunnel, that when things go wrong, people eventually will behave differently and correct things. That has been done since the beginning of history.
Eyal Winter. Eyal, thanks for being with us here on Radio Who, What, Why.
Thank you, Jeff. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you for listening and joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.